All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for sticking around, first and foremost. It's been a long day, but I hope this will be a great end to the day, a great cap to the day. My name is Jay Jacobs. I'm going to be the moderator of this panel. And I have a list of questions that we've developed and gave copies to all three of them. So hopefully we won't catch anybody off guard with anything, but I want to start off here with a pretty easy question. Could any one of you define risk quickly?
All
right, no, that's just a joke.
People would agree with?
That was just a joke. No, but seriously, and Ali, you talked it in your keynote this morning about defining risk and the concept of risk. How important is that working definition of risk that people agree on it?
Well, it's very important because there's so much confusion about what risk means. There's so many definitions that are commonly used in the industry, and many of them contradict one another. The most important contradiction is where some people believe risk is high probability and high loss, and others believe it's low probability and high loss. So you can't get anything more contradictory than that. These are two diametrically opposed views on what risk is. And obviously, if you go into a meeting and one group believes it's A and the other group believes it's B, they're talking past each other because they don't really even understand that they're talking about completely different concepts. So you start out by, the reason we wanted to do this is to make people understand it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of understanding they're two different business problems. They're both important business problems. And we get confused by the terminology. So let's agree on terminology, and then we can agree on business problems. And we've proposed that the definition of risk be adverse deviation from the expectation. That's consistent with one of the most important risk axioms we've all accepted, which is risk represents uncertainty. Where there's certainty, the risk is zero. So building on that foundation.
Mike,
It's on.
Oh, it's upside down, maybe. No, just go back and say everything that you just said again.
I bet we picked up a lot of that. I could hear you. So.
Okay, so this is much better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering what I was doing wrong. I should have. But so anyway, where was I at? Yeah, again, so it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of understanding that these are different concepts. And each concept helps, by defining these things in a particular way, each with its own definition, where we have a better understanding of the business problems we're solving. So yeah, the thing I was saying is you go into a meeting and people think they're all on the same page in terms of risk. And so, but if one group believes that high risk is A and the other group believes high risk is B, they're using the same word and meaning completely different things. So even where they think there's consensus, there actually isn't. So that's why definitions matter, because, particularly of risk, because this is one of the most important definitions, important concepts, and it's never been defined.
Yeah. And before we get too far, I should have done introductions, and I don't have any sort of a bio or anything for all three of you, but Ali, obviously we saw your keynote this morning. One of your most influential works for me was your paper on operational risk. That was a few years ago. And Jack Jones in the middle, the creator of the FAIR methodology, author of a recent book, and the title is?
Measuring and Managing Information Risk, a Fair Approach.
Yep, and that just came out like a month ago.
A month ago.
Yep. And so that's on Amazon and various places like that. And Jack and I know each other from years ago. I went through FAIR training, things like that, but he's spent years developing FAIR and teaching it, training people, certifying people in it, talking to companies about risk, specifically information security risk. And then Doug Hubbard on the end, you've got three books. Three books. Multiple editions of your first one. Third edition is out right now of How to Measure Anything. And definitely also a heavy influence on me. Did I capture everything? You're also a consultant. You decision management support. I'm really struggling here for words. Am I capturing most of it?
Yeah, that's basically it. All of our clients in all the different industries they're in all have one thing in common. They're making decisions under uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that's what we deal with.
Yeah. Okay. So let me jump back into a question here. all of you three actually on the stage were influential to me, and I think to many people in the room that have seen your work, and I've all seen your work before I met you personally. But who, for each of you, who has been influential in your career as you were developing your talents and your skills? Who was the person, or what was the thing that really triggered for you that this is what you wanted to do? How did that come about for you guys?
Well, I was just going to say my most influential person was my first quantitative methods professor in grad school. But I guess I can't say that because I honestly can't remember his name.
Well, what about that person triggered
I
it
guess
for you?
it may not have been that influential, but I remember the classes. They were there. I didn't imagine them. All the math I had up to that point was all about physics and math. Mm-hmm. So this was a big change, that quantitative methods actually applied to policy decisions and investment decisions. It wasn't just about orbital mechanics and relativity and stuff, right? It actually applied to other things. And so it wasn't all, decisions under uncertainty. We did the game theory. A lot of it was operations research, optimization problems like linear programming and dynamic programming and transportation algorithms and so forth. And so I got into how powerful those could be. I kind of like that people made money with math because I saw a lot of the people that went through the physics programs and would end up with a PhD, and I didn't think they were doing that well, really. I'm glad they love what they do. I'm sure they did, but it seemed like you could even be more impactful, unless you win a Nobel Prize in physics or something. It seemed like you could be really impactful by affecting big, uncertain decisions in government agencies around the world and big corporations. It really seemed like it mattered.
Yeah. Jack?
Yeah, the person that comes first to mind to me is a guy named George McKinnon. He was the executive that when I was a new CISO at Nationwide Insurance, it was his questions that I couldn't answer that prompted me to begin working on FAIR. And without that conversation with him, I wouldn't be sitting here.
And the questions were, because I know them, I get to ask
Yeah.
those.
So the questions were, I just presented my strategy and my budget request of many millions of dollars. And he said, so tell me, Jack, how much risk do we have? And if he'd asked me to talk about the threats we faced or the vulnerabilities we had, I could have talked all day. His question was, how much risk do we have? And I shrugged my shoulders and said, well, lots. And he said, and if we spend this $12 million you're asking for, how much less risk will we have? And I said, well, less. And I left that meeting recognizing that those were not trivial questions, but they were reasonable questions, and I needed to have a reasonable answer. And so the last 13 years has been spent, in developing an answer to that.
Good. Ali?
My answer is similar to Doug's. Actually, it was my high school math teacher, and I do remember his name.
That counts.
Is David Nelson. For a couple of reasons. One, somewhat more humorous, but he didn't give partial credit because his idea was that, if you're building a dam and you get a calculation wrong and that dam bursts, you can't go back and get partial credit for that. So it forced me to become much more precise or much more accurate in what I did. But the other thing that he did which really helped me was that when I was a junior in high school, he got me to start teaching the freshman algebra class. And his view, well, he was lazy. He wanted someone else to do the work. But his idea was, you can't know something, or you can't claim to know something until you can teach it. And particularly when you're teaching math, even if you find it objective, systematic, and logical, there are a lot of people who don't see it that way. And how to explain something that you may be convinced is completely logical to someone who thinks differently. And that's really guided me throughout my career, because very rarely do you run into people who think exactly the way you do. So being able to try and understand where they're coming from their questions, and then tailor your response so they can have better understanding. I was really fortunate to get introduced to that way of approaching explaining problems in high school.
Yep. And also, I'm sure we'll come around with the mic. If anybody has a question too, jump in, but I'm just going to keep going down my list. So obviously all three of you have accomplished quite a bit already in your career. is there something in your career that may not be widely known that you're very proud of? Like something that came up that you were able to accomplish? And it could be something very public too. It could be works that we've already cited or something like that. But is there something that you are most proud of, and why, and how did that come about? Or let me ask this a different way. I think I stumped you guys with that question. If you guys had a do-over, would you do something different, or would you tackle a problem sooner? Is there something that you would want to shift or change the way you approached studying what you did?
In my second book, The Failure of Risk Management, the reason you write a new book is to get in all the stuff you didn't get in the last book. That's always what's motivated me. So in my second book, just after that, I was coming across a lot of new and already existing research about a placebo effect in analysis. That if you go through a process that seems structured and formal, you're going to feel better about your estimates. You're going to feel better about managing risk. Just because, hey, we went through a procedure, it was developed by a big consulting firm, and we rated everything as on a scale of 1 to 5, and it's all high, medium, low, and they all have colors, red, yellow, green. And is your risk management better? And they would say, yeah, I think the consensus is it's definitely better. Well, even though I kind of hinted at that in the book, there's really quite a lot more now. I think I'd make that case even stronger now. Now I added more of that to the third edition of the first book, but it seems like that was a big thing I could have added.
Jack, do you have anything that you wish you could focus more on or do differently?
I would probably, so some of the more recent developments in FAIR have expanded the view from measuring risk to understanding, being able to measure risk management. Because at the end of the day, how much risk we have today is a lagging indicator of our ability to manage risk in the past. Decisions we made and our ability to execute got us to where we are, right? And I had actually kind of developed the early notions around that 6-8 years ago, and then put it on a shelf, and really only brought it out publicly in the book a month ago, and I'm wishing I'd not waited that long.
Yeah. Ali, do you have anything?
Well, actually, what I'm doing right now, writing this paper to define risk, which has really been my basis for living for the last few years. I'm glad I'm doing it now. I wish I could have solved or found a solution the way I'm thinking about it earlier. It's something that bothered me from the time I was in graduate school, when it was almost assumed that risk was volatility or uncertainty or variance. And that just didn't sit well with me, because clearly, we all know that risk relates to the adverse aspect. So how everyone could just assume something that seemed blatantly wrong concerned me. I wish I could have had time to work on this earlier, but it's taken 3.5 years of almost a full-time effort. So I don't think I would have had the opportunity earlier.
Yeah. Well, we're glad you're doing it now. So Doug, you mentioned your second book, The Failure of Risk Management, and that was written back in 2008, correct? During the financial.
Early. Actually, the manuscript was done just before the beginning of the whole crisis, and then I got one more shot in the check of edit to add any new material, and so it came out really early 2009.
Okay. But you state 3 reasons that risk management fails, and I'm going to read them here. So first, the failure to measure and validate methods as a whole or in part. Number 2, the use of components that are known not to work. And 3, the lack of use of components that are known to work. And that was 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago that you wrote that. How have you seen that change, if at all? Have you seen that evolve?
Well, there certainly at least seems to be a little bit more skepticism. I have a lot of big pharma clients, several. And when you look at how they test a new drug, they assume it's a placebo until they prove otherwise. Now, if you think about it, if we actually analyze decision-making methods and risk assessment, risk management methods that way, we'd come up with completely different methods. You assume it's a placebo, and then you try to prove it's not. I was going to add, too, that in the second book, there's a whole chapter called The Ivory Tower of Babel, and it's all about different definitions of risk, and I talk about Frank Knight's definition and the PMBOK definition that includes positive outcomes as risk, and there's a couple bizarre engineering ones where risk is a binary thing and uncertainty is a range. There's a whole bunch of goofy stuff. But ultimately, I come right back to where Ali is. We're talking about risk representing a function of various magnitudes of losses and probabilities, usually expressed as loss exceedance. So we're coming back to the same place.
Glad to hear that we have
Yeah.
consensus in our thinking.
Jack and I actually both raised our hand at the beginning of the question when you were asking, which of these are higher risk. You said you did. I'm not by myself, am I? All right. So we both raised our hand on the one that you said was the wrong answer. But I think it's the wrong answer for a couple of things we ended up agreeing on. One is we weren't necessarily assuming that high probability was near certainty. It might have been 30% or something like that, because I define in my book, that if it's a near certainty, it's really a cost. Like Walmart doesn't have a risk of shoplifting. That's a cost of doing business. Your companies don't have a risk of your payroll, right? That's just a known cost. And in a way, when they built the Empire State Building, there wasn't a risk of death. There's approximately, deaths happen with some rate in those large construction projects, the Hoover Dam and so forth. The big risk was having extraordinarily more than you expected. Mm-hmm. So it's all about comparing to expectation. The other issue was conflating, I think, possibly whether or not you even have high probability, high impact events versus whether or not if you had one, would it be worse, given our definition of high probability. So, but otherwise, other than that, we're on the same page.
Jack, as I mentioned, he's the creator of FAIR, and through the years, you've traveled quite a bit, given a lot of training, and certified people on the FAIR method. How have you seen the approach to measuring risk evolve through the years? Because I know that FAIR has evolved through the years. How do you see people adopting it and things like that? And where do you see, how important is the training and certification that you did as part of risk assessment?
Sure. So the evolution has been somewhat of a surprise to me because I was a CISO, and so my world was information technology and information security sorts of things. But I've had a lot of people use it to analyze a lot of different types of scenarios and circumstances. So we've had people, one bank used it to determine an optimum overdraft threshold for checking. Another bank used it to determine how much risk is associated with providing banking services to the new marijuana growing industry in Washington State. A healthcare organization used it to understand how much risk is associated with opening a new bariatric treatment center. One gentleman used it to analyze how much risk was associated with letting his 16-year-old daughter drive to an event out of town by herself. It was more than he was willing to live with. So seeing it used outside of the technology context, the information security context, has been enlightening for me, because every time I go and work with a client or someone who's using it in a scope that's not my area of expertise, I just soak that in because I just learn from it. But it's gratifying for me to see that it's that flexible and can be used in that many circumstances. As far as training and certification goes, the new certification that's out there, well, training I think is important because you get people using nomenclature consistently and concepts consistently and such. So it reduces variability in how it's applied, the mistakes and such. And the certification that the Open Group provides around it, to this point about nomenclature and such, that first certification that's out there is really all about terminology and concepts. This really doesn't focus on how to apply it. That's the second certification that's coming out. But you need to start with concepts and terminology. So that's.
And I know, Doug, you do a lot of training as well, correct? Mm-hmm. And where do you see the value of that kind of thing? I know you talk a lot about calibration, if you want to talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, so We focus on methods, like our pharma clients, we focus on methods that have actual clinical trials of improving performance. So independent, academic, published, peer-reviewed studies where this kind of method measurably outperforms an alternative method. Well, it turns out that most people can be taught to be about as good as a bookie at putting odds on things. It takes about a half a day, and our success rate is about 85%. About 85% of people who go through calibration training end up, at the end of the training, about as good as a bookie at putting odds on things. And this is done in a series of trivia questions, right? You take trivia test and you say, true or false, a hockey puck will fit in a golf hole. You say, true, how confident are you? 80%, right? You do this over and over again until we get a large number of trials of each one, and then we show you how bad you were. And then you take another test, we show you a few techniques, there's a few tricks, things like the equivalent bet, and there's a few other methods that are already in literature. We've actually, this year, we've trained just over 1,000 people. So we actually have more data on calibration training than all of the published academic literature combined on calibration training, which adds up to 500 or 600 data points, 500 or 600 people. So there's a lot of great research on that. But we go a little bit further because the whole point of getting calibrated is just to use you as an instrument. So most of my clients, they can imagine easily a situation where if they use an uncalibrated instrument and some measurement, it would cause a lot of problems. Clients in nuclear power, clients in the pharma industry, clients in mining engineering or big construction management or anything like that. They can easily come up with situations where using an uncalibrated instrument causes lots of problems. But when you think about it, where does a lot of the judgment come from regarding cost-benefit analysis or risk analysis or assessments of risk? They're coming from a human being. And we almost never know the performance of that human being when they give us an answer of some kind. And so calibration has to do with treating that person a little bit more like how they're being used, which is as a measurement instrument. As a measurement instrument, they have about measurable performance. And we know that if you don't calibrate people, they're off by a lot. And some are really bad. Doctors are horrible at putting odds on things, for example. But most professionals, including people in IT and cybersecurity, are about as overconfident as Harvard MBAs. That's about where you are when you start out at the beginning of the training. But that's just the calibration training, because ultimately, in addition to just being trained to be a measurement instrument, you have to figure out what to do with those. So we say that's what you initially populate Monte Carlo simulations with. If you've got what we call arm's reach data to populate a Monte Carlo, you use that. But you start with your calibrated estimates. And the reason we do that, and this is another thing we cover, is we model your current state of uncertainty so that we can compute the value of additional information. Now, the formula for the value of information, if you don't know this, has been around for over 60 years. It's been part of game theory and decision theory for a long time. It's not a new thing. But if you start computing the economic value of information to reduce uncertainty about where your big bets are, what your risks are, et cetera, it turns out you probably measure completely different things. And so those are a couple of levels of training we go through. So the calibration's one, but the other track is for analysts, people who aren't the subject matter experts, who aren't going to be providing the estimates, but they're the people using the estimates. They're going to be building models and so forth. And there's a couple of levels of it. There's an executive overview where your main takeaway is all these conceptual ideas. You know, learning about a loss acceptance curve is like a big aha moment. You get that one done. And then you get into more technical stuff. Here's what you got to do when you build a Monte Carlo. Here's how you compute a value of information, et cetera.
Okay. And I want to change the topic a little bit to dealing with skeptics. Obviously, risk management, risk analysis, there's a lot of opposition to some of the techniques, and maybe they're new, maybe they're valid on some level, but one of the criticisms that I've heard, at least in our industry in information security, is this: we can't do that because we have a lack of data, but then they add a qualifier and they say we have a lack of actuarial quality data. For you, Ali, what does that even mean, and how valid is that type of a criticism?
When you first suggested this question and I read it, I said, you know, I'm reluctant to even answer this question because it seems as though there's a false premise built into it, in that the data doesn't exist. But really, this question gets to something more fundamental, which is, what do we mean by sufficient data? And I was wondering how to answer that question, and I was thinking, do I need to explain how models work and help you create histograms and PDFs and CDFs. And I realized, there's a really simple example, similar to the example I talked about in my presentation. Supposing you want to build a house on the beach, and you want to know how far up the beach you need to build your house to make sure that your house doesn't get destroyed by a wave, and you have a 1 in 100 year or 1% tolerance in any given year. You're willing to tolerate the 1 in 100 year event. If you collect data for 5 years, and you collect all the wind-driven waves, over a 5-year period, you'll probably have 1 million waves. You ask a normal statistician, is that enough? Well, 30, if I want to calculate mean and standard deviation, 30 to 35 days. So you have a wealth of data. Would you rather have that 1 million data points of wind-driven waves, or would you rather have 10 data points collected over 500 years of the tsunamis that hit that beach? Because if you take that 1 million data points and fit it to a mathematical model, very sophisticated model, it will fit a curve based on the understanding that the worst case thing that would happen would be a wind-driven wave. But in reality, that 99% level event, the 1 in 100 year event, is not going to be a wind-driven wave, it's going to be a tsunami. So all you need to do is use a very crude technique, 10 data points in 500 years, the 1 in 100 year event will be the second highest loss. And it gives me a much better estimate. 10 data points and no model versus 1 million data points and a really sophisticated model. If I'd presented that question that way, how many would have said 10 data points and no model? So this whole question about data sufficiency, very often we think of data sufficiency in terms of number of data points. But if we're trying to model at a certain confidence level and we're looking at it on an annualized basis, so what's the 1 in 100 year event? It's the number of years in the data collection period that drives it. So when you look at say the banking industry and they want to model operational risk, many organizations believe that the way you model your risk, because you're unique. And I learned the term from Doug earlier today, what is it, the fallacy of the uniqueness fallacy. Uniqueness fallacy. The idea is that you believe that because you're so unique, none of the other data applies to you. Well, if you're a bank, there's certain characteristics you have that are similar to the other banks. Why did JP Morgan have an unauthorized trading event and SocGen and all these other, they're all unique, but they're all exposed, if you're in the trading business, you're exposed to rogue trader risk. What would you rather have? If you've never had a rogue trader event, use some other data and try and extrapolate from 1 million data points, or use 10 data points from the industry, knowing that you'll be directionally correct, maybe not precise. So I think that's the fundamental problem here. When people talk about data sufficiency, they don't realize there's a ton of data out there. It will help you get a directionally correct number, which in many cases is 100 times better than a measured number from a model based on data that's not ideally relevant. Now, one other quick point I would make. The way I presented this problem, if you know that the 1 in 100 year event is going to be a tsunami, you'll say, okay, I need to model tsunamis separately. The problem is many times we don't know that our data sets or our categories are heterogeneous. We assume they're homogeneous. We assume there's only one kind of wave. And then everyone's shocked. How did this black swan event take place? Our models are great. The model predicted the worst wave I'll have in 1,000 years is a 10-foot wave. How did I have a 30-foot wave in year 6? That's fundamentally, that sums up one of the biggest problems about modeling. And whenever I've given a talk on what caused the financial crisis, or anything relating to this, it's modeling requires you to understand we have heterogeneous data sets, and we assume homogeneity. And under those circumstances, you shouldn't be surprised when you have these model results that are completely inconsistent with the models.
And that sets up I'm going to softball a question to you, Doug. How do you actually, what is the criteria to measure a good model? What represents a good model?
Well, it kind of is the same response to your question about how do you answer the skeptics. Models have a measurable performance themselves. I've had a bunch of clients that were big Six Sigma followers, and I can still tell you what processes they don't measure. They don't measure their portfolio approval process. They don't measure their risk management process. They don't measure the return on performance metrics. So those big apex things they don't deal with. But the good news is there really are large clinical trials in published peer-reviewed journals about the performance of lots of pieces, and we call it component testing. So one way to get the big picture impact, we're dealing with this right now with our client in Kenya. So we're measuring the performance of the global intervention decision model, which they're talking about agricultural interventions for the developing world. So it's not just in Kenya, it's all around. And we built this big Monte Carlo simulation for dealing with all sorts of agricultural interventions: irrigation, dams, microfinancing, seed banks, terracing, and other farming techniques, et cetera. So it's this huge model, and they select different modules to deal with different kinds of interventions. And now they want to set up a measurement for that. This was actually a recommendation from our approach that all models are wrong, so is this one, and we're going to set up a process for measuring and improving the model as we go ahead, so we're continuously validating it. Well, the best way to do it, ideally, is to have great big controlled experiments where you've got a whole bunch of people using the global intervention decision model to inform a whole portfolio of decisions, and then a bunch of people who aren't. You track them over decades, because some of them are very long impact sorts of things. And then you say, oh, look, the people who are using the global intervention decision model are actually better. So it's the year 2080, and you finally figured out, by the time you're off to Windows 546 or whatever, you figured out that one is better than the other. But there's also component testing. Component testing is faster. We can test individual pieces of the whole system, just like this is how you do risk management or risk analysis on a rocket that's never flown before, or the design of a nuclear reactor that no one's ever built before. You still know the failure rates of individual components of the system, and you can model the system. And then you set up cascade and common mode failures, and you say, hey, there's this problem that happens some surprising percentage of the time when I run these simulations. So you're actually testing components, and component testing gives you very fast feedback. There's already a lot of literature on the performance of components. We know the performance of calibrated estimators. We know the performance of naive statistical models compared to human experts. It's really hard to beat a naive statistical model, by the way. And when someone is a skeptic, my answer to that, because I'm really answering both questions, when they're a skeptic, I say, hey, I'm a sucker for empirical evidence. If you could show me one study that showed that people actually made better decisions over a significant number of trials using, say, high, medium, low, scale of 1 to 5, putting it on a heat map kind of stuff, I would start using it. There is no such thing. The only studies that exist is that they're no better or they're actually slightly worse. They add error. In fact, one of the studies was this guy, David Budescu. He actually studied how people use ordinal scales, like very likely and somewhat likely or unlikely for substitutes for expressions of probabilities. And he used a term that I think actually kind of directly relates to what Ali was saying before. He called it the illusion of communication. You and I both agree that something's a medium risk, and when you debrief us, you find out we meant completely different things. So that's David Budescu. He did a whole set of experiments and surveys on this. It adds error. It actually can make you worse off than your unaided intuition alone. So why even adopt a method that makes things worse? You know that phrase from medicine, first do no harm? Yeah, let's first do no harm. Let's not make it worse above all else. Yes?
Well, I just want to follow along.
Wait.
And that's something that Tony Cox said, worse than useless. Right?
Yeah,
that
that's
type
right.
of a model.
I quoted
Worse than useless.
So, along the theme of skepticism, we often hear, well, fine and good, but we're dealing with intelligent adversaries, and consequently, there's no way to predict their behavior, and so game off. How would you respond to that?
Can I actually respond to that? I mean, I'm just a moderator, but I want to respond to that. So actually, Wade Baker and I did a presentation at RSA last year where we actually took the actions of the adversary as classified in the Varus framework, and we looked at how random was that. And it turned out to be absolutely not random. I mean, that's what we do, right? A null hypothesis. We say if they're intelligent and adaptive, that means that if we cannot predict them, they must be random, right? I mean, randomness is a core component of crypto, right? That makes crypto do well is that there's randomness. So we said, let's look for randomness. Or and more specifically, let's look for the lack of randomness. And not only was it there, but like we didn't even need math. You know, I mean, there was so much patterns in there. I mean, it was so blatantly obvious that there were patterns. And therefore, I mean, anybody who says intelligent adaptive, therefore we cannot predict our actions, that would indicate randomness, and there absolutely is no randomness. So.
The empirical side of that too, I might just interject there, is that remember we're comparing models. What's the alternative model? If somebody says, well, you know, we have these intelligent actors and so they're really unpredictable, you can't just extrapolate from historical data, therefore I have to rely on my experience. And they say that with no hint of irony, right? Yeah. Well, you're only comparing two models. If the alternative model is their intuition, how are they dealing with the human actors? What is measurably different? Now, I won't say the name, but I was sitting next to one of the letters in RSA at the RSA conference, and he made the same point. He said, but the problem with information security is you're dealing with intelligent actors. And I said, so you think that differentiates you from actuarial science or insurance? Do you think they never have to insure against fraud or kidnapping? I mean, they insure lots of things. Often what happens is people think of the consumer side of insurance, my automobile, life and health and so forth. But actually, actuaries deal with all sorts of risk that include things exactly like that, including things they don't have millions of data points for.
Yeah, so if I can jump off of that as well. So when I'm faced with a skeptic around data, right, and very often I'll include pretty much what you just said, which is anytime a decision is being made, there's comparisons being made based on some model of some sort. It's either the individual's mental model, and Lord knows what that looks like, right?
Yeah.
And data of some sort. And so if they're pushing back on we don't have enough, you know, actuarial quality data, or what I'm saying, for a quantitative analysis, I say, all right, what kind of data are you using for your mental model that you're doing the analysis? There's always a model and there's always data. And I guarantee you that the data they're drawing out of, you know, their memory, right, is not going to be any better than what we would get through some sort of logical, rational effort, focused effort. And as far as the models go, unless they're, you know, some people with great experience gathered over years, right, they may have a very well-developed mental model, right, but that doesn't scale worth a damn, right? And so, but most people don't have that. And so if I have to bet on a mental model versus some model that's been kicked around, right, and hopefully been vetted and proven over time, that's where my money's going every time.
Good. Another question?
So this is not a softball question.
This is just for you guys.
So all three of you are on this panel because you've made seminal contributions to advancing the state of the art. Yet I think we'd all agree that risk analysis, risk management, information security has not reached the pinnacle of maturity and has not achieved the sort of impact and results that we hope it to. What do you think it's going to take? What advancement of practice, what advancement of the state of the art will it take, and how long is it going to take to get there?
Everyone just has to read our stuff.
Yeah, that's where I was going. Well, but there's truth to that, though. Seriously, there's truth to that because so much of what is out there is so bad. I mean, really. So when I was developing FAIR, I literally swore off reading anything written for the industry for like 4 years. Because two reasons. I didn't want it to pollute my thinking, right? And it just drove me to madness to see the stuff that was being published out there that couldn't logically stand on its own, you know, in any way, shape, or form, right? And so I think, you know, certainly these guys, and I like to think the stuff that I'm writing is contributing too. I think that's what's going to carry the profession forward. But until there's, and frankly, I'm not an optimist in terms of how quickly it's going to happen, because there is so much inertia out there. So much inertia. I mean, I'm in meetings, you know, and I'm in industry groups and such where the preponderance of people around the room can't agree on a definition of the problem we're trying to solve. So until you get past that, right, it's just painful.
Also, I'd like to add, you're not alone. You may recall that we had a financial crisis a few years ago, and banks who claimed to be experts in risk management were all taken by surprise when they found out that the risk was actually 100 times higher than their 99% level confidence had predicted. You know, in the risk space, I'm actually very frustrated, in particular in operational risk. I don't go to conferences or read other people's, well, I shouldn't say all, but the majority of
send
stuff.
you my book, is that it? Okay.
The majority of stuff that's out there is, you know, you can list the things that are just conceptually flawed or illogical or just inefficient.
Right.
So, you know, but again, one of the reasons we have this problem is you have a principal agent issue. This is part of the reason, one of the reasons we have the financial crisis, where you will do what's in your best interest. And even though you're working for a certain firm, sometimes your interests diverge. Sometimes your interests diverge, and when they do diverge, you will do what's in your interest at the expense of what's best for the company. And particularly in what drove the financial crisis is these guys knew they were taking too much risk. If you read our paper in the appendix, we talk about the what happened at AIG with credit default swaps. And I can't remember now, but this is all principal agent issues. People were being very well compensated for doing things that looked good on paper based on the metrics that were being observed, but actually they were the wrong metrics. So what they were doing was destroying value, but they were being compensated very well for it.
Among other things, they used methods like value at risk, and they figure out really fast that you can tail load risk, right? So you can kind of hide all the risk by putting it at one end of the distribution because your metric doesn't look at how extreme the loss can be. It just looks at what your 5% worst case or 1% worst case scenario could be. So the metrics themselves actually incentivized hiding risk. So
let me explain what that means. You know, just not to get too technical, but if I have a model and the model says at the 99% level, my risk is $10,000. Well, that seems like, okay, it's not so bad. But VAR models only tell you what happens at that point. They don't give you any indication of what could happen beyond that. What if I tell you that at the 99% level, it's 10,000, but beyond 99%, in that 1% time, I'm going to kill you? That's different. Now, how do you solve that problem? VAR is being heavily criticized, but the technical solution to that is to use what's called TVAR, where you simply take the probability weighted mean of that space beyond VAR. Okay, but people can game that as well. So this is the fundamental problem. You've got smart people who understand the metrics, exploit the weaknesses in the metrics, and this will happen again. So really, you've got to have someone overseeing this stuff who has the right incentives. Okay. Because again, if you bring in a consultant to validate the model, who are you going to choose to validate your model? Someone who you know will give you the right answer. What happened at the credit rating agencies? You want to get a AAA credit rating? No problem. Pay us this fee and we'll be happy to give it to you. So all of a sudden, junk got a AAA rating. So here's, until we address this conflict of interest and the principal agent problem, we really can't have confidence in any of the metrics we're working with.
So how much time do we have left here, Lisa? Do we have, because
we've just completely gone off schedule, and I don't care. I mean, I love it. So, but maybe we should do a vote, or maybe you should make an executive decision.
Well, let me at least get one more question, and then if anybody else has some questions, we can go there.
Okay, all right.
So around this skepticism, for this type of thing, obviously with the financial crisis and all the other, there's always a headline showing the failure of quantitative analysis. And I think Warren Buffett even said, beware of geeks with spreadsheets, right? And I think all three of you at some point have been labeled a geek with spreadsheet in that context, right? What is the...
How dare you?
By others, not me, of course. Who are the biggest skeptics? Like what, and Jack, I know for you in information security, it was surprising to hear years ago when you talked about the biggest skeptics that you've come across. Who are these skeptics and what are the objections? What are the big objections to this type of an approach?
I've run into two classes of skeptics. Those who see the world strictly through a black and white lens. There is no gray in their world, right? Their world is binary. It is compliant, it's not compliant. There's risk, there's no risk, right? They can't deal with the gray. And you run into that not infrequently, but the more common is the person who took high school statistics and believes that they understand probability and statistics and such, and that, well, if I don't have 30 data points, then I can't do quantitative analysis, and they will sit there and they will argue tooth and nail. I was doing a workshop with one client where we were trying to get subject matter expert estimates from one of their subject matter experts using calibrated methods and such. And I said, what would your estimate be for this event? I forget what the event was. And he said, I couldn't give you a number. I said, well, here's how it works. I reiterated. He'd been through the calibration thing, right? He didn't do well. But
he was in that 15%.
Yeah, and he said, no, I couldn't. So I said, so you're telling me that this event, I think it was like, the frequency of an insider, trying to hack your, network router on the inside, not the outside of your network, a trusted insider. I said, you think it could be, I don't know, 1 million times a year? Oh yeah, it could be 1 million times a year. Really? I said, how many people are we talking about? And do they have jobs and this sort of thing? And I could not get him to actually make an estimate. He would not, under any circumstances, give me a range.
We actually have some data on that. So, since we've calibrated about 1,000 people, remember it succeeds about 85% of the time. About another 10% of the time they improve significantly, but don't quite reach statistically indistinguishable from a calibrated instrument. And 5% don't seem to improve at all. My wife pointed out, my wife's a math teacher, math professor at a local community college, and she pointed out that you've heard of dyslexia. There's actually something called dyscalculia. And about the same percentage of the population has dyscalculia as dyslexia, and it's about 5%. In other words, numbers are utterly meaningless to them. They don't even understand, they don't have a context for them. And I don't know if that was just an observation. I don't want to publish that yet. I think just an interesting observation that there are 5% that just don't get it through the, everybody else is getting it. But at least here's one thing we have now. We have all this data that says, hey, everyone else got it. What's wrong with you? So at least they know then it's not just the procedure for the training or whatever. They know that other people are actually exceeding at these things. I guess I have a more complex variety of skeptics. Maybe I just decompose it more. I have a challenge in my first book. It's a $10,000 prize, and I'm happy to write the check anytime, for anyone who could prove that you can prove anything with statistics. It's not even been attempted to be claimed. The book was first published in 2007 with that stated prize. It sounds like a joke. I'm serious about it, but people say it all the time. And I said, well, then you got $10,000 coming if you can prove it. I'm serious. And it's been out there. No one's even sent me a single email saying, I think I might have you on something. Because obviously it's absurd.
I can probably take a stab at the converse.
What's that? That you can prove nothing with statistics.
Or, something more sinister, which is the expression, statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics.
Right. And I've run into that one too. I would say, well, it's true, I can prove anything to you with statistics, but you can't prove anything to me with statistics.
Yeah.
You have to have some knowledge about these things. So yeah, what they mean is it's easy for people to get suckered by numbers. If that's what they mean, sure, yeah, it's possible. I run into other situations where people will say, I've run into the 30 sample size. I say, well, you know, that's just the point where you can use the Z statistic as opposed to the student T. The student T and the Z statistic converge. At 30, you can just use it. That's what that meant, because I guarantee you that chapter on student T distributions was for smaller samples than 30, right? And I was telling this story at lunch that I'm in a room full at a pharma client where there's several PhD biostatisticians, in addition to a pharmacologist and all these other types of people. And I asked them, here's results of a sample of 5. I showed them a sample of 5 out of their whole organization. Is this statistically significant? And a bunch of people shook their head right away. Well, the only correct answer is you don't know. I haven't told you my p-value, my significance level. I haven't stated a hypothesis yet. There's all sorts of things. But certainly you could have a hypothesis you were testing where a sample of 5 was significant and it was useful and it told you more than you knew before. So people have this pre-math judgment they make about what uncertainty reduction they can get from the data they have, or how much uncertainty reduction is justified given the risk and the magnitude of my decision and my uncertainty about it. They're just winging it. You know, when someone says we don't have sufficient data to measure this, I say show me your math, because that's actually a mathematical claim. When somebody says they don't have sufficient data to measure this, what they mean, or what they should mean, is that I've already worked out in advance how much uncertainty reduction I get from my given data, and that uncertainty reduction doesn't actually reduce uncertainty from my current state without looking at the data. Actually, no one's ever produced their calculation to demonstrate this. It's just simply a presumption that people throw out, and for reasons like the uniqueness fallacy, I used to call it the fallacy of close analogy, and then I found out there was a term for it, and then I started calling it the uniqueness fallacy. But the fallacy of close analogy is one of the reasons why people think they have very little data, when in fact there's quite a lot if we're resourceful enough, right? The anecdote I was using before was my insurance company has technically no data on my rate of death, other than I haven't died yet. So how do they work out a life insurance premium for me? Aren't I unique? There's no one else exactly like me. Well, of course, no one else is exactly like me, but they can still interpolate from larger heterogeneous sets. So yes, you're all unique as snowflakes, just like the trillions of other snowflakes, all right? You're all uniformly unique, okay? And we can still interpolate. When someone says, I cannot extrapolate from dissimilar data, they've just shot down their whole claim to expertise. What's their experience based on, right? I suppose one category, I'll just insert this one special category of skeptics, since this is the group. I think I run into possibly more skeptics in information security.
Yeah.
So since I have a little bit of crossover with information security in my other work, I really think people in information security might be a little bit more likely, I'll reserve this as a hypothesis until I collect more data, but anecdotally I'm observing that they're a little bit more likely to believe they're unique and special. That their risks are actually different from my risk of my clients who dig mines in Canada or have risk of drought in the Horn of Africa or something like that.
Well, we get that argument all the time.
Yeah.
Our risk is different.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it's
Well,
not.
everybody's
It's
risk is
fundamentally not different.
Oh, well, I mean, everybody's risk is different in some way, I suppose, but we're uniformly different.
Rachel?
Believing you would be accommodating you.
Believing me would be on. Hey, I'm all about, like I said, I'm a sucker for empirical evidence, and I have simple, too small to be statistically significant trials that we can set up in spreadsheets where we can do tests over and over again to estimate the means or medians of populations. And if somebody doesn't believe those simple equations, we can set up a simulation and I can just bet real money until they run out. Or, or until they give up and say, I agree.
I have another anecdote to talk about information security people. So I do a lot of statistical research and stuff like that. And I'll present to security people the research I do, and I'll also present to statisticians talking about the code and the language and all that stuff, talking about how I arrived at things in my industry. And security people, I'll say, yeah, I came up with this, and they're like, well, wait, how'd you do that? And I'll be like, principal component analysis, hierarchical clustering, stuff like that. They're like, slow down a bit, go through that again, and then I'm talking to statisticians, and I'll say, principal component analysis, and they'll be like, oh, okay. You know, like that's the end of the discussion. But security people are very, very skeptical. They're like, I don't really go through all of that again. You know, explain how that works, because that doesn't match my statistics course from high school.
You know, another angle that I think we should take is we should invite skepticism. Absolutely be skeptical of models. I just say be equally skeptical of your expert intuition. Hold this, you know, judge that by the same standards. What's the performance of that method? It is a method that has been measured, by the way. It has a measurable performance. And many components, many parameters of that method have been measured. We know that people are statistically overconfident. We know that people are highly inconsistent. No matter how many decades of experience they have, they can't seem to give the same answer twice. You know, have you ever had to sit down and judge a list of things? Like the cost of an effort or the risk of a bunch of different things, sit down and judge them in a list. Should the order of the list matter? It shouldn't, and it does. It's been tested a whole bunch of times, just the different orders of the list. It's called anchoring. It's a well-established effect now. So we have all of these psychological weird quirks that we have. But here's the key thing. Remember, no matter what you're doing, it's about a model. And all models are wrong. But some models are measurably more useful than others. You know the story of the guys getting ready to go hiking in the woods, right? One guy sits down and starts taking off his hiking boots and puts on his running shoes. And his buddy says, what are you doing? He says, well, I heard there were bears in the woods today, so I thought I better put on my running shoes. His buddy says, well, you can't outrun a bear. He says, I don't have to outrun the bear, I have to outrun you, right? That's all we're doing with the methods. I'm sorry if everyone's heard that a bunch of times, but that's all we're doing with methods. We're talking about measurably better. You don't have to go for perfection. It's just better than it was before.
Yeah. Patrick?
I can't resist, I'm sorry.
Here, Patrick,
There are certain species of wolves that by their hunting techniques, if you outrun me because they have sent some runners up ahead, you'll just get eaten before I get eaten. Yeah, that's true in nature.
Well,
So
you have to know the threat, right, Patrick?
you have to know your
Something about
threats.
the threat.
The other thing I'd like to comment, I think everybody probably knows by now that I worked in medicine for a long time. And one of the most astonishing things that I learned early on is the role of expert judgment in the assessment of clinical outcomes. Non-medical people tend to assume that medicine has all this great data. And depending, if it's pharma, if it's medical therapy, maybe. But if it's a surgical modality, you know, not so much. And I think the big secret, information security people don't get this, is that really every discipline relies rather heavily at times on the role of expert judgment. Physics, chemistry, everything. So I just wanted to throw that in. But remember about the wolves when you start talking about the bears.
You know, there's always anecdotal exceptions.
Yeah.
So if we evaluated a drug based on anecdotal exceptions, homeopathy works great. Because then you can always think of an anecdote where it worked, right? But
So I think we'll try to wrap it up here, but if we could just go through each of you and just say, sort of along Russ's question about where should people go? Like if a lot of the people, I think practitioners are always looking for the next thing to learn, the next thing to look at. What's a resource that's helped you? Or you can even say, you know, go read my book or something like that. But what would you recommend people go do to learn more? It might be a loaded question, but.
well, a lot of the things that I would recommend for that are things I actually cited in my book. So yeah, go read my book. So that's a one-stop shopping to go look for all of that. But I would say one key thing, just look outside of your own discipline.
Yeah.
It's not new. It's been done before. I tell everybody, no matter what you're measuring, just assume it's been measured before, assume you've got more data than you think, assume you need less data than you think. Those are very productive assumptions. They almost always turn out to be true. So no matter what you're assessing, just assume that somebody outside your world has done something like it, that you're really not unique. That's a great place to start, to assume you're not unique.
Yeah, along those lines, when I said that I had sworn off for those years anything, you know, written by anybody in our profession, what I substituted was materials written by people outside of our profession, right? And I had, literally within 2 years, I read 40-some different books on probability and statistics and decision making and just weird stuff that was really outside of what we might think of as applicable to this problem, but that had some little nugget in there that really fed the development of the concepts and such. And so a big part of it too is being open-minded and open to being receptive to things that might seem tangential but might not, right? Because that's, I think, where leaps sometimes occur, right? It's a mutation event, if you will, mentally for you in terms of how you're approaching or thinking through a tough problem. Because these are not trivial problems. I mean, even if we get the nomenclature down straight and we get decent broken models, we're still faced with some really tough challenges, and getting past those, because we're not unique, right, sometimes takes prodding or some sort of insight from an unexpected source. And so you have to be receptive to those sources when you're walking through Barnes and Nobles or whatever, and you see a title that just, what the heck does that mean, right? Pick it off the shelf, because probably a quarter of the books that I read that were really substantial in helping me grow my own understanding and develop FAIR didn't come from the statistics shelf or the business shelf or anything like that. It was something kind of like, lady tasting tea or something like that. And I was like, that's odd. And I'd pick it up and there'd be something really, meaningful in there. So just receptiveness to things outside of what you might think.
I'd like to just echo the same sentiments because none of us are omniscient, but there are a lot of good nuggets in virtually everything. I, for a long time, stopped reading things in the risk management space because I saw so much I disagreed with, and it was just fundamentally wrong. And but I think one of the things we need is why we wrote the paper is there needs to be an industry consensus definition of risk that's a robust, theoretically valid definition. And then we can have an intelligent debate on this, on many of these topics, rather than, people talking past each other. Mm-hmm. So by the way, also some of the stuff I've written a few years ago, I'm embarrassed to have to admit to. So, as we grow, we learn more and recognize the mistakes we've made.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks our panelists for taking the time today.